at the end of the day, we all just want to be loved, accepted, and recognized. And we can't forget that within our organizations, no matter what it is that we're doing.
Welcome to Vibecast, the podcast that dives deep into the heartbeat of workplace culture. I'm your host, Christy Skutvik. Join me in conversations with extraordinary leaders as we unravel their experiences, both positive and negative, that have impacted workplace culture. This podcast is more than storytelling. It's about actionable insights. Are you ready to transform the vibe at your workplace? Let's go. Today, I had the pleasure to speak with Chris Tuff. Chris is a best-selling author of 2 books, The Millennial Whisperer and Save Your Asks, and a keynote speaker for several Fortune 100 companies. Chris shares lessons on empathy and genuine connection at work on some of the largest stages in the world. Chris has said, in a world where everything is connected, we've never been more disconnected from each other, especially when it comes to the workplace. Chris understands this challenge like few others and can provide the steps that are much needed to get back to authentic connection to maximize a company's culture, retention, and returns. I hope you enjoy and learn a thing or two. Well, I'm so happy to have you, Chris.
I am so fired up to be here, Christy. This is going to be so good. Thank you for having me.
So I just want to hear, you have these books, you have these people, you have these connections. What I really want to hear is just, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what we're trying to accomplish here is work vibes, right? So This Vibecast is here to just tell the stories of what people have seen, heard, felt, experienced, so that others know that they're not the only one, or that there's better out there. So I just really want to have a conversation with you today to experience what you've experienced.
For sure. Well, so I think one of the important things to understand kind of my journey is to back up and look a little bit at my history, right? So, I graduated from Vanderbilt with a huge ego in 2003 and ready to take on the world. I moved to Boston, where a lot of my family had found their successes, youngest of 6 kids. And I had 64 failed job interviews. And, it was actually through that process, that lucky 65th, I came back to Atlanta with my tail between my legs and no ego, and fell into the beautiful burgeoning world of digital media, right? As we were coming out of really the .com bust. And it took me a few years, right? But it was actually through that process of failed job interviews that what those interviewees didn't see in me was a passion for what I was going after. Mm-hmm. And when I didn't really know about advertising, right? Like I didn't know you could get paid to be creative. Like this was crazy to me. And I was pretty excited to do that. And what was interesting is that I made 5 lateral job moves once I had landed that job at a very small but hyper growth ad agencies called Moxie Interactive in Atlanta. And so I was an account executive for 2 years. And as you can imagine, since now we know each other, Christy, I was not the greatest account coordinator because I had to take notes and it was just very detail oriented. And, I saw the creatives having super fun. I'm like, I can write. How hard can that be? So I became a creative copywriter. I did that for about 2 years. And I was, as advertising history goes down, one of the worst creative copywriters ever. And then I'm like, my dad's now at this point taking me aside. And, he's British. Christopher, what are you doing? You're still making $28,000. You've been there for 4 years, right? Yeah. I'm like, Dad, just hold up, right? I think I'm getting closer to that zone of genius and passion. And it was right in around 2006, 2007, I had the opportunity to work directly with Mark Zuckerberg as he was going from colleges to the general public on behalf of our client, Verizon Wireless. So got to work directly with him and his team. And then the rest was kind of history. And what I tell especially young audiences is that when you fall into that zone of passion within your profession, when those things start to overlap, ridiculous things tend to happen. And it was right at that time, I obviously, Facebook wasn't a thing. It was pre-YouTube.
Right.
And the owner of our company goes, okay, so our client Verizon Wireless wants their own viral video. And I've told them that you can figure it out because you're so good at like this emerging tech and stuff. And I was like, yeah, of course. But she was like, well, we have to prove to them that you can get a viral video. Chris, can you do that? I was like, yes, for sure. What's a viral video? Right. And we had no idea. No one knew what a viral video was because it was before YouTube. And so once I figured out, it's just to get like millions of people to watch your thing, I was like, I've got the perfect opportunity because I had been patiently courting my now wife at the time. And I had the ring, I had everything ready. She and I are both identical twins. And I wanted our identical twins to see it.
What a trip.
Yeah. So I was like, I was getting so impatient and I'm like, I'm just going to film my engagement. By the way, no one had really filmed their engagement before. And I ended up calling. So I haven't actually really told any audiences this after like 700 podcast interviews up till now, but I was the finalist in the Real World. And so I got to know for the Chicago, it was season 11. And so I got to know some of the cameramen there. And I called up one of the local cameramen. I was like, dude, can you help me film my surprise engagement to my wife tomorrow afternoon? I'm going to do it while I'm running down one of the super flat, straight streets of Atlanta. And I'm going to pop the question to her and I'm going to pretend to sprain my ankle. I'm going to go from spraining my ankle to popping the question. He was like, absolutely.
Oh my God.
So this dude was hidden in the back of the car. I had a wireless mic on. My wife had just gotten back. She was a professional soccer player at the time. She had just gotten back from practice. She was so hungry. She had just eaten something. I was like, we're going on a run right now. She's like, I don't want to go for a run, Chris. I was like, no, we have to do it now. Like, meanwhile, there's a guy in his car with like I have a camcorder hidden up in a tree and a wireless mic on. And so anyway, I ended up popping the question and it was a scale of emotion. She said yes. And it was a scale of emotion that the internet had never really seen before. And I also branded our whole wedding, doublementwedding.com, and I built a website for it. And this whole thing totally took off.
Oh my gosh.
Good Morning America flew down and interviewed us for Good Morning America. We were on the front page with our pinpricks, top of the fold on the Wall Street Journal. My dad and family's calling me being like, what is happening? I'm like, I have no idea, but like, obviously I'm doing something.
Is this video still out there on the internet?
It is. So it's on my wife, Julie, who once again had a lot of success as a professional soccer player, was a little bit annoyed at the fact that she was getting more attention for our very private engagement than she was for her accolades in soccer. And so I have it on my Facebook page that every anniversary I'll put out there. So anyway, so like that to me, like that was my first taste of this, like, wow, like ridiculous things really do happen. And I want to inspire more of that. And I really created a name and what I call my first currency around digital and social media. That's what people called me for, right? That's where I provided value and how I became a partner at an ad agency and all that stuff. But what happened along that way was like, just like any human, our passions evolve. We have kids and we move to that next stage, and those don't always line up to our vocation. And so, it was actually hitting rock bottom in 2016. I hit my rock bottom. I took a year off, and it was actually in that moment that I was like, all right, things need to change, right? I'm obviously not that passionate about this thing that I've now become known for. And I'm just going to take my efforts. I'm going to double down on my family, my 2 daughters and my wife. And I'm going to really put all of my efforts into our young employee base. And there were 400 employees there. And that's what I did. And, people look back and they're like, oh my God, Chris, like you pivoted so quick, but it was a hard 7 months. And it was 7 months into that, after really taking my house down to the stilts and rebuilding it, it was funny. I turned to my wife with tears in my eyes because I'm like the most extroverted person in the world. And it was right before this executive retreat. And I was like, Julie, I don't even really have friends anymore. Like I'm home all the time. I quit drinking. There are a lot of big changes that had taken hold. And she looked at me and I'd never really seen that compassionate side of her. And she felt bad for me. And she was like, Chris, things are going to turn. I know it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that weekend that I did this executive retreat with 14 entrepreneurs from Atlanta, all men. And I introduced myself around that fireplace on the first night to really show that someone can be vulnerable. And, the average age was like 50 and, everyone was like, pretty proud and not willing to kind of get deep. And I was like, oh, I'll do that.
Did you have the yellow glasses at that time or did that come after?
So the yellow glasses were just coming onto the scene. Okay, so my white glasses were really up until then. Then yellow was just coming in.
Okay.
And so I introduced myself to these guys as I was about to get super vulnerable. And I was like, guys, I don't really know what I do anymore. But to be honest, I'm kind of like the millennial whisperer at my firm. And then I went and shared my story and I sat down in the fire. These guys kind of look at me weird. And one guy finally chimes in. He was like, dude, these millennials are the worst. And another guy chimes in and was like, yeah, I've had to come up with new job descriptions for my crew. Another guy's like, yeah, I mean, I'm having to give raises every other month. I can't keep them around. Tell me some of the stuff you do.
Yeah.
I was like, well, guys, it's not unlike what we're doing here. It's really taking a vested interest in their life and establishing genuine connection. Let me tell you a couple of the things that I do. And the one that came instinctively to me was what I do in all my hands meeting, which is what I call snaps. And in my all hands meeting on the Monday, I would say, all right, I'm going to give massive props to Christy because she crushed it in that meeting. And then I'd explain why, and then everyone would do snaps, and then they'd start doing peer-to-peer recognition using snaps, and it would go on for like 40 minutes, and it would just set this awesome vibe, right?
Yeah.
And energy. And so it was 3 weeks later, 4 of the guys on that retreat called me, and they're like, Chris, you're a genius. I started doing those tactics, and it's totally changed around my employee base. And the guy leading the retreat, a guy by the name of Tommy Breedlove, said, Chris, you got to write that book. And I was like, what book? He goes, The Millennial Whisperer. And so I wrote it in typical me fashion in 4.5 months, super fast. I worked with Vanderbilt University to pull in a lot of 72 different data points, blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. And then that was really where my currency began to evolve. And, it was about 9 months into that run that the book really started to take off. And I started to work with companies like Nike, all with the intention of basically Trojan horsing these massive organizations and then bringing the agency behind me. One of the things that I did not anticipate was a pandemic. And so I found tons of success and I was just ramping up to some of the big stages, and then the pandemic hit. Mm-hmm. And it was actually a call from I was supposed to be doing a keynote with Heidi O'Neill, who's the new president at Nike, for all of the sales organization. It was her assistant that said, hey, Chris, this speech ain't happening. Sorry, because we don't know how long this pandemic's going to last. And, it's my 20-minute rule is like, okay, you can dwell on something for like 20 minutes and be sad. And when something doesn't go your way, then bounce back, right?
You do work fast, 20 minutes. Most people give themselves like 20 days.
Yeah. And I was like, I gave myself 5 minutes to be sad, really, because then I was like, well, what's the book I was really meant to write? I love talking to these companies about culture, but the one thing that everyone goes to me for advice around is how I have such an insane network and how I go about sales. And I had actually done a guest lecture at Vanderbilt for the senior class that was the highest rated guest lecture. And the title of that was How to Network Like a Mofo. And I was like, what if that's the foundation? I'm just going to teach that. Meanwhile, I began to notice how many people go in for their asks way too early. And I call those people ask holes, right? There's people that are going for ask after ask. And so I wrote Save Your Asks during the pandemic and for 2.5 years. And I never really wanted that to end because I ended up meeting some of the most amazing people. And so fast forward to right now, Christy, it's now I'm working with companies around really my dream and my purpose to inspire and connect, but really to unlock as many dreams as possible and those passions in as many people as possible and allow them to actually go after that. And that doesn't mean quitting your job in order to see that. And meanwhile, every company in C-suite is really struggling with the fact that they can't attract or retain with any of their talent. And So, I would actually say 70% of my speaking and talking, or maybe 60% is around retention and attraction, which is the millennial whisperer. And then 40% is with more sales-centric audiences that's rooted in saving your asks.
How did you, in this, this time you talk about like the dark time in your life, how did you uncover, besides this group of guys, right? And they said, you're like the millennial, or you introduced yourself as a millennial whisperer and then started talking about it. And I'm sure they saw the passion in you around it, but how did you uncover that was in fact what you were going to go back to this ad agency and start doing?
So 3 things changed in my rock bottom. All right. And one was doubling down on my wife and my 2 daughters, right? Reorienting my life around them and truly being there for them. 2 was quitting drinking and the whole, because, it wasn't doing any good. And it was the opposite of what I'm all about, which is genuine connection. I'd actually hang out with people. I'm like, oh, well, they're tolerable, right?
Yeah.
When you take drinking out, like a lot of people aren't tolerable anymore.
Totally.
Right? And so that was number 2. And then number 3 was my metric of success. And I don't know if you've read Mark Manson's The Subtle Art. I was kind of like looking at anything of not giving an F, but I read that. And there was this really impressionable chapter around success. And it made me look long and hard at myself and my metric of success up until that rock bottom, which was the most horrible. If I was super honest with myself, my metric of success up until my rock bottom was beating my brothers at the game of life. And I looked at that. I'm like, that is probably the worst metric that you can come up with. And so I'm going to change that metric to success being judged on a daily basis when my head hits the pillow. Did I have the impact that I intended today? If I can impact just one person's life in a positive way and use the gift that God gave me around getting people fired up and my optimism and being able to see the big picture on this stuff. Like if I can do that, I'm going to be successful every single day. And it's going to be a hell of a lot more fulfilling. And that was really that catalyst of taking that metric of impact and having it be seen through others versus just myself. And there's no better way of that actually then taking form than putting my time and efforts into the next upcoming superstars within our organization.
And what did you see happen with those like in the organization once you switched your mindset to impacting others versus the success just through yourself? Like, tell me a little bit about like what you saw, what people said, how that felt, what the organization started to see.
Well, one was I started looking at the data, right? So the data informed a lot of my hypotheses. Some maybe a little surprising, but I've got a pretty good gut check on stuff. Like, what's made me so successful up until that time was I got a high EQ, right? Like I'm not the smartest dude. Like I will admit that, but I've got really high, I can read people, I can tell energy, right? And so by taking the data that through the process of what happened at that, I was just experimenting, right? Like with different things up until that 7-month period. And then I started looking at the data as I'm like, okay, I'm going to write this book. We got to start documenting this. And I looked at, the fact that for millennials and younger millennials and now Gen Zers, it hasn't really changed. What they're looking for out of leadership is inspirational leadership, autonomy, and transparency. And so as I started to go down this road of looking for it, not only would I interview and get qualitative kind of examples of that, but I started implementing that myself, right? And experimenting with new things and tactics that then became a large part of what was the final product of the Millennial Whisperer. And so I got that almost real-time results within a team of 400 to what worked and what didn't. And so I guess that's my long-winded way of saying that like I built the plane while I flew it, while also being authentic to my desires and message. And I think that one of the things that frustrates me now being kind of surrounded in this group of like thought leaders and authors is the lack of authenticity within that space. People that write and say one thing and do another. And I hold myself up very much to a high standard of authenticity, right?
Yeah.
So like, what if I was writing this book and I was a horrible boss, or,
What
you
have
know,
you
like,
seen like drives that inauthentic nature of people who put something out there and then aren't that themselves? Like, why?
I don't know how deep you want me to get into that, because a lot of this stuff's hard. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this stuff does take high vulnerability. It does take,
Sure.
I just posted a thing on quiet quitting, the decision
Mhm.
tree. You should see some of the haters coming out. But one of the things I recognize in humans is that, generally speaking, you've got 50% of the population that have some sort of bias the other way of what you're kind of taking a stand for, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's also going up against the greatest thing I run up against in especially larger organizations is the mentality of, well, I had to do it this way. Why don't they?
Mhm.
Right? Like, especially like work flexibility, some of those big things that
Yeah.
we've got to start adapting our viewpoint on. And I'm not saying with work flexibility, for example, to these leaders, is everyone should be able to work from where they want to work. Like, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying, like, let's expand our definition of what that looks like within the execution within our own four walls. So where I'm getting to on that is that it's really hard to stand for something that is against the grain. And I'll read feedback in my keynotes, and I'll never be able to win that 10% of people that want to punch me in the face.
Sure.
Right? My job up on stage is to take the 50 and lower that number as much as possible. And it's funny, as I work with my speaking coach and now, the team that I've built out to help me in this area, I tell them, I'm like, listen, like, I get that negative feedback. If I saw myself up on stage with like yellow glasses and like, I'd want to punch me in the face. Legitimately. I'd be like, who is this loser? Right?
Easy
like
for him to stay up on stage and do all these things.
Exactly. And look at him taking all the credit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Like, so it's like, I kind of get it, like I kind of get where they're coming from. And until you really get to know a person, right?
Yeah.
It's, and I equate a lot of that to the way a lot of us were raised, right? And I mean, even technology's influence on a lot of us. And when I talk about the intergenerational workplace, and I'm not an intergenerational expert, I'm just really good at instinct and just being a natural leader, getting people fired up, right?
Right.
And so I guess my point in it all is that it's really hard to actually practice these things because it goes against everything that a lot of us were brought up to believe. And vulnerability, some of these traits that are now being held up in a new light, whereas they weren't before, you got to do the work, right?
Yeah.
Like, it took me hitting rock, and it's not that my side of the street wasn't clean when I hit my rock bottom. I wasn't that bad, right? Like, like my cleanup didn't take long. And my side of the street is squeaky clean. Like, what you see is what you get. And if people aren't willing to go deep or I'm going to move on and go to the next thing, because that to me is the most important part. Because I want to change the world.
Yeah.
And I actually feel like I finally am starting to do that in a handful of these use cases. And I take that responsibility very seriously. And the one thing that I hear from leaders when no one else is around after I do my speech or work with their teams, is they'll take me in the corner and this leader will say, all right, so Chris, I run a 5,000 person organization. I'm the owner, blah, 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 right? I drive 5 Ferraris or whatever it is, right? And I'm living an inauthentic life, right? What I am at work is very different than what I am at home. And I have zero passions in my work. I actually kind of hate what I do. So it's clean up on aisle age 55 to 60, right? That it's like, okay, here's some of my exercises if you are there. And it makes me that much more focused on like, what if we can actually get after these people at a younger age, right? Like, what if with
100%.
And I'm not there yet, but what I really want to take all of this stuff is into our schools. I want to start at age 13, that when our identities are set, let's create a choose your own adventure that can actually show where it is that you should and can go. I went to Vanderbilt because it was the closest thing to an Ivy League school that was acceptable for my parents to put in their Christmas letter.
Yeah.
Like, there's no other reason for it.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like changing our mindset around like these preconceived notions that have been filtered in for years and years and years, not just into us, but like into our parents, into our grandparents. It's like that history of knowledge that gets us nowhere sometimes.
Exactly. And, we also are expected to be all things to all people, right? And, you look at leadership today within, especially some of these larger organizations, they want these super organized savants to also be the inspirational leaders and the outgoing. And it's like, no, like we've got to look at teaming up to our strengths.
Right.
And instead of asking that one person to be all things to all people. And, when I talk about inspirational leadership, I did some work with Tony Robbins's team around this whole thing. And it was actually Tony that brought up, he goes, Chris, have you ever heard of LAE? And I was like, no, tell me more. He was like, well, the biggest problem in leadership and inspirational leadership is LAE, low as energy. I was like, I love that, right?
Yeah.
And so we got to bring HAE. And I'll talk about that when I'm doing these speeches around the Millennial Whisper. And it's so fascinating because it's always afterwards that these, in one case, it was a dentist. And this dentist is out of Charlotte, young dentist. And he came up to me after this speech and he was like, so Chris, I'm a massive introvert. And like everywhere I go, I'm LAE. But if I need to bring HAE, what are some of the tactics that I can do to get my people fired up? And I gave him a couple suggestions, and he was like, "Chris, no, I'm not doing that." I said, "Okay." So it was like the third suggestion. I was like, "Well, what about music? Like, what music can you put on the loudspeaker that will not require you to have to be, try to be a me, right?" And he goes, "Chris, I got it. I'm going to report back." And he goes off, and he texts me 6 weeks later. He was like, "Chris, call me." And so I call him, and he was like, "So here's what's happening. Like, I don't have LAE anymore. And my people are so fired up going into our all hands meeting on Monday mornings at 7:00 over the loudspeaker. I play Shaka Khan's Tell Me Something."
Oh
Good.
my gosh.
And then
So
everyone
good.
goes to the break room and they tell me something good that happened in their week. And they tell them something good of what it's like your snaps thing, but a little less cheesy. And I was like, dude, I love that. That's perfect, right? And then I talk about like the art of the flyby, right? Like take a vested interest in your people, start following your people, your team on social media. So when you come in on a Monday, go by their desk and say, Christy, that trip you just took to Charleston looked epic. Like, where did you stay? Right? Just take a vested interest in their lives because it's that connection that so many people are craving. And at the end of the day, we all just want to be loved, accepted, and recognized. And we can't forget that within our organizations, no matter what it is that we're doing.
Yeah, we're humans, right?
Right.
Like, regardless if we're at work or at home or with our family or friends or strangers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Am I getting fired up enough for you, Christy?
Yeah, you are. I was going to say just like a personal impact moment, right? I think I shared this with you probably about a month ago now. I was like having that who am I moment, like, what am I here for? What am I doing in my day to day? Who are my clients? Why are they my clients? Like, who am I? And then through various conversations and just like trying to get myself unstuck, I would say, is how I was introduced to you. And just like the conversations or the introductions or just like the ideas, it shifts your mindset and then just gets you going. Like the momentum that you create and impact people is quite incredible. So just personal impact to myself.
Sure. And that, like, to me, and I like, it's interesting, right? Like, because from an outside perspective, people can look at me and be like, Chris does all of this stuff for Chris. And it's like, no, I don't. I do it because it fires me. What gives me the greatest amount of energy is when I can act as that catalyst for others. I don't need anything in return.
Totally.
I mean, so almost to like my own, like now I got to start monetizing this stuff because I got 2 kids and a wife, but like, there's nothing that brings me more energy and joy than being able to unlock the dreams for others. And so whether that be me, that's what's made me such a great connector up until now and why I ended up writing the book on it and saving your asks. Like, go and give, right? Go and give those things. And so like to be able to allow you to do what you do best, Chrissy, because you're really good at what you do. Like, and and I've told you that, right? I have a very high bar. I've met with everyone in the HR world, but like you're really good at what you do and you move fast and you do the work, right? So you crank through my tests of like, where is it that I can focus my time and energy to act as that catalyst and then move on to the next thing. Like, right. And I know through you're going to change millions of lives through work vibes and everything that you all are building. And that to me is the greatest return on my time and energy. In the same way that, I don't know if I've told you this story, but I wrote a blog post on it and it's titled "The Most Important Question You Can Ask Anyone." And I established connections through what I call a race to the middle, which is finding that common passion point. But I immediately take it to the next level as soon as I feel like that energy is matched.
Yeah.
And so once again, practicing what you preach, if you write about it, you got to do it. And my daughters won't even actually go to the store with me because sometimes when I'm feeling that energy, I'll do it. Right. Like yesterday, I was at my daughter's conference and the librarian was showing us the new library. And of course, Julie's like, oh gosh, here we go. We're going to be here for like 45 minutes because I dive in and because I want to get the librarian her new Nikes that are size 10 because she was complimenting Julie. And I'm going to go order them right now. I'm bringing her with my books. And I'm also going to talk to her about her dreams because the most important question we can ask anyone is, what is your dream? What fires you up? And for whatever reason, we feel as organizations that we can't ask that because it would sacrifice potentially them leaving or whatever else. And it's like, no, you help them get to where they want to go. The best thing we can say to anyone is thank you for working for us. Now go do that thing that you were born to do.
Totally.
And so I was in the Turks and Caicos right after I published Save Your Ask, which is my happy place, kiteboarded with my family. It was after like a long day and we went to this restaurant and it was totally quiet. And, you know, I can see you as one of these people, Christy, where you go to this restaurant and like you're the only one there. People are dressed up and you automatically feel bad for them because you're like, oh my gosh, like there's like 9 servers for us. And how are they even making money? And there's one of those nights, right?
Yeah.
And the young server comes up to us. The kids are exhausted. They're like running around. And it was immediate connection because this guy had the brightest smile, young, 22 years old. I uncover the fact that he's from Haiti and he has a name that I've never really heard before. And his name is John Lee. And so John Lee and I start talking. I just got goosebumps. So John Lee and I just start talking about what got him to where he is. We uncover the fact that he's one of 11 kids, right?
Oh,
he came to Turks and Caicos 5 years ago. He has 3 jobs. He's getting his university degree in hospitality, and he's doing these 3 jobs pretty much around the clock. And he has the best attitude. And so he calls me Mr. Chris, and he goes, "No, Mr. Chris," and he'll answer any of my questions. And Julie's kind of like rolling her eyes, but also like really into this dude, John Lee.
Yeah.
And so the dinner progresses, right? And our bond continues to get stronger and stronger.
Yeah.
And I turned to Julie and was like, I'm going to go there. And she's like, oh, geez. Okay, great. And I go, John Lee. He comes back. It's right before dessert. I go, John Lee, tell me your dream. I want to know what your dream is. And don't give me some BS answer. And he thought about it for a second. He goes, okay, Mr. Chris, my dream, I have 2. One is to go back to Haiti. I want to see my family. I want to see my 10 siblings. I want to see my mom. She's not doing well. And my second dream, Mr. Chris, is to come to the US and work in hospitality. Those are my dreams. And I go, yes, that's what I'm talking about. And he goes and grabs our dessert. And as he's getting our dessert, I'm like, Jolie, we're totally taking his first dream out, right? Like, we got to get him a ticket to Haiti.
Giving me goosebumps.
So she goes, absolutely. So John Lee comes back and he goes, okay, Mr. Chris, here's your dessert, blah, blah, blah. Right. And I go, John Lee, you want to hear the best news of the night? He goes, yeah. I go, you can just focus on dream number 2 because I'm going to buy your ticket to Haiti. Give me your Venmo account, blah, blah, blah. Right. And it was like $450, best $450. He just breaks down crying. Like, no one's ever done this for him. I mean, who knows, right?
Yeah.
But for most people, it would stop there, Christy. Right. And so John Lee and I, now 8 months later, we FaceTime once a week, and we text almost every single day. And here's what's cool is that like, it was actually like 5 weeks ago. I was texting at night, and we just watched our Netflix show. It's like 10:30, like way past my bedtime.
Yeah.
And Julie's like, who are you texting with? I'm like, John Lee. We're working on getting his visa because we're going to totally hook it up. And I also tell him I'm going to write a blog post about this because we're going to get you that second dream now that he's about to take his trip to Haiti.
Okay.
And so I post this blog post on it, and two incredible leaders, one who's a very famous entrepreneur, was like, Chris, if you need help getting John Lee over here, I'd love for him to work for my company that I'm building out of LA. And then I had another person go and be like, Chris, is there anything? But like, so once again, that's one case, right? Like
connecting with people and building the dream.
It is. And it's not that I do that stuff to try to like create a blog post or give me material to talk about in speeches. Like I want to figure out a way to do that more at scale. And to me, why we're talking, Christy, why we're, collaborating on some of these work vibes thing is I finally feel like the world is ready for it, and that we can, within our own organization, start bringing some of this thinking that can have immediate impact, right? Because the John Lees of the world, like you run out of time and it's not scalable, but that's what excites me so much about work vibes and what's being built around it.
And the rad thing about it too is like, not only could we impact organizations, but that personally, that leader who's struggling and hates their job might all of a sudden turn around and just love what they're doing because of the transformation they're seeing in other people, just as you described.
Exactly.
So cool. So cool.
For those listening and I'll give everyone listening, we'll set up something on Work Vibes. I'll give them a free downloadable copy of the PDF of either one of my books. Christopher Tuff is the LinkedIn, and then Tuff22 on Instagram. And then my website is www.christuff.me. And
awesome.
Fired up.
I just so appreciate you. You guys check him out. He's amazing. He's impacted my life personally, and just so appreciate you sharing the good news.
Here's to many more.
Here's how Chris Tuff describes a good vibe within organizations. They're places where people feel loved and accepted and recognized. Now, here are the 3 ways to create a high vibe. First, take a vested interest in your team members' lives and establish authentic connections. Then, measure success by asking yourself daily, did I have the impact that I intended today? And finally, hold yourself to high standards of authenticity. That was a great interview with Chris. Thanks for joining us here on Vibecast. Keep vibing, friends.
If this episode inspired you and you want to see how you can take the next step to creating a better vibe within your organization, I'd love for you to download our complimentary 75 Vibes worksheet. This is a simple tool to create a habit and mindset around creating great vibes in work and life. The best part, it's simple and it works.